Okay, so our lesson tonight is going to be really quick. We're just going to talk about congruent figures and some things that we know about them. So you all know congruent figures means things that are the same size and the same shape. That's our definition of congruent figures. We want to add to that corresponding parts are congruent. Okay, so what that means is that, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. All right, so let's look at this one example and just kind of get some things marked. So we've got a congruent statement over here that tells us LMNO is congruent to WZYX. So notice that just because one of the figures is listed in alphabetical order doesn't mean the other one is going to be. We talked today that letters correspond with one another, so L is going to correspond with W, and what we can mark on our figure is that means those angles are congruent, so angle L is congruent to angle W. Similarly, angle M is going to be congruent to angle Z. Angle N is going to be congruent to angle Y, so notice I'm using different counts of these arches for each angle, but to pair them together correspondingly. And then angle X is going to be congruent to angle O. Okay, so angles are going to be congruent, which we can list, and then also segments are going to be congruent. So segment LM, which you can kind of read your figure, that's between angles 1 and 2, right, is going to be congruent to segment WZ. And then I can go around the figure kind of with this same logic and mark congruent angles. Or sorry, not congruent angles, but congruent segments. So you just need to know that corresponding parts are congruent, and we can use that to solve problems. So for instance, if we knew that LM was 7 inches, then we would also know that WZ was 7 inches. All right, that we're going to use that kind of concept to solve a few problems together tomorrow. All right, so we're going to use this concept to solve a few quick little proof problems. All right, so it says quadrilateral JKLM is congruent to NPQR. So we know in terms of our reasons, that's something that is given. One thing you want to get in the habit of is probably marking things that are given here. So if we know that those are congruent, and we also know they're telling me angle J is congruent to angle K. All right, so I'm going to say that that is also given. So some other things that they're going to tell us. They're telling us in this next statement that K is congruent to P. And we know that K is congruent to P because of this congruent statement. K and P are both in the second spot there. So the reason is that corresponding parts, we're kind of shortening this reason, are congruent. And it's really corresponding parts of congruent figures are congruent, but that is a whole lot to write. So I'm just going to write corresponding parts are congruent. And then if we look at our reasons, it's saying J is congruent to K, and K is congruent to P. So J is congruent to P. Hopefully you recognize that from last week. That is an example of the transitive property. All right, I'm going to show you one more proof down here at the bottom. This one, they don't give us any information. We just have to start on our own. So I'm going to show you how we would set this one up and kind of work all the way through. So you know the first thing we need to do is just set up our statements and reasons. And our first statement is just going to be to copy the given. And in order to see what I need to do with that, I'm actually going to mark my figure. So I know that S is going to be congruent to VST is going to be congruent to TSW here based on that statement that they gave us. I know that angle V is congruent to angle W, still based on that statement. And I know that this STV is going to be congruent to STW. All right, so I've marked the parts of the figure that correspond to one another. I could mark the sides also, but I'm noticing that this proof is just asking about the angle, so that's why I'm only marking the angles at this point. All right, and if I think about this statement, it says that ST bisects angle VSW. Well, I know bisects means to cut it into 2 equal pieces, and if I look at my figure, I actually already have that marked. I know that those 2 pieces are equal to one another. And the reason I know that is because they are congruent. So my step 2 is to say that those angles, VST is congruent to angle TSW. And the reason there is that corresponding parts, so corresponding parts are congruent. All right, and then from that, now that I know that those are congruent, I can go ahead and say that my statement that they're asking me to prove is true. I know then that ST must bisect angle VSW, and the reason there is just because that's the definition of something being bisected, is that the two parts are congruent to one another. All right, so any proofs that we do tomorrow are going to be very short and simple, just like that. So make sure you have both of those proofs and the notes from the first slide in your notes, and we'll be ready for tomorrow.